I'm Jean-Marc Lim, and on behalf of the team here at JSA, thank you for tuning in into our latest virtual CEO Roundtable, also our last one of 2021. But before we get started, I wanted to quickly share that JSA is seeking top innovators across the globe to collaborate on a book entitled Greener Data: Insights on Reducing Carbon Emissions from Leaders in Digital Infrastructure. The book will make its Amazon debut on Earth Day on the 22nd of April 2022. If you would like to learn more about the book and submit for a co-author consideration, please visit jsa.net/greenerdata. But back to today's event. Our first 100 registrants for this stream will have received a fresh lunch delivered to your door or a gift card to order your own meal. And today we are excited to share our JSA virtual roundtables on a new platform to include the first in the industry virtual networking experience, with a unique opportunity to talk face-to-face with other event attendees before and after the panel. Make sure you head back to the networking lounge after the discussion for live networking with speakers and attendees of today's event. As a quick reminder for everyone who has joined us today, we look forward to your participation during this event. So please feel free to add any questions that you may have into the chat or request the mic to come on camera and ask your question directly to our speakers. If you have any questions about upcoming roundtables, whatever it may be, such as how to register or how to participate, feel free to reach out to us through our website at jsa.net. And also, by the way, just as a reminder to mark in our calendars, our next virtual roundtable will cover telecom and data centers and look at the lessons learned and predictions for the new year. And without further delay, let's get started. Today, we'll be looking at the state of the European data center and network infrastructure market. As 2021 draws to a close and COVID is still plaguing our world, forcing new ways to engage and do business, it's time to take a temperature check on our network infrastructure market and the state of the European data center partnerships, opportunities, challenges, and predictions for 2022. It is my pleasure to also introduce to you our exceptional executive lineup, which includes Anthony Clarkson, Technical Director for EMEA in India at Precision OT, David Barker, Founder and CTO of 4D Data Centers, Alex Rabbits, Director of Corazon and Managing Director for the European Data Center Association, Gary Connolly, Founder of Hosting Ireland, and Tash Mehta, Associate Director at Vipa Digital. I'm actually quite excited to have this lineup of speakers, because I'm sure this discussion is going to be really, really engaging. So before going in with any clever questions, I'm just going to ask you a general question to the panelists. How do you describe the current state of the market? Who would like to take the first shot? There you go, David.
Jump in first then.
Yeah. You won the race here.
Yeah. It's very good, to put it short. Across Europe, obviously more familiar with the London market. That's where we operate. There's been a lot of demand over the past 12, 18 months. There's still a lot of supply coming online. Some of that supply is delayed due to various, mostly supply constraints from construction. But overall, we're seeing extremely high demand. A lot of people still moving IT out of their offices, a lot of on-prem still migrating into data centers, and a lot of growth in people doing services that facilitate remote working.
Okay. Tash?
Really just adding to what David said, there has been a huge increase in demand, and, we can all think that as a result of COVID, people working from home, just increased use for smartphones we were talking about. Working from home, it's just huge at the moment. I also predominantly know the London area because that's where I'm based, but in all of the kind of flat D, as the term is, Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, Paris, Dublin, they're growing in all of the other parts of EMEA as well.
Okay. Well, Gary, would you like to add the Dublin side of things?
I guess it's extraordinary what's happening, really, because we've heard so much about the Industrial Revolution 4.0 that commenced, in and around 2017. And from there, you heard a lot of C-level people talking about digital transformation. And I think what we've seen over the last 18 months in particular is a digital acceleration. So for those that were already on that journey, internal, external, whether it's business to business or business to consumer, the acceleration and adoption of digital services, for many companies, as the other two speakers said, whether it's via the handset, whether it's via a headset, or whether it's via desktops. It's been a lifeline for business, and it's not going to change. You know, habits, this is the key thing I think that we're seeing now, is that if we had had this disruption for 6 months, habits may not have formed. But we're entering into our second full year of businesses being transformed and having to depend on the infrastructure, including the centers of data, and it's not going to be reversed. So I think from a Dublin perspective, with the growth that we're seeing, it's on a percentage, you know, year on year, same as the other North Virginia, Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, and Paris. I mean, I think we're all looking at 25% compounding annual, you know, growth. But the big difference is in Dublin is projects that were predicted for 2024 to start are already out of the ground. So we've eaten into what you'd call that fat that was there for that spike. That sort of fat is starting to diminish. And now we're starting to eat into what we thought we'd need for 2024 and beyond. So I think it's just starting. I know that's hard for people to believe, but I think for those that are in the data and look at IDC and look at Gartner, when you look at sort of the predictions for 2027, that the amount of data in the world today is only 16% of the data that will be here in 2026 or 27. You know, think about, okay, it won't be one-on-one, but it's just starting, because digital is not first anymore with businesses. It's nearly digital only. And by the way, we have offline stuff as well, should you want to have a look at it.
I mean, what you're saying is amazing, because we've seen Microsoft this year announcing the intention to build 50 to 100 data centers a year, just to try and cope with this, as an example. I mean, we used to get excited about one data center, $1 billion. Now we get anything below 1 billion, it's almost not even worth writing about. So, I mean, it's really accelerating. And I mean, Facebook is investing 26 billion this year alone. That's more than most data center companies' valuation at the moment. And that's only one company. But Alex, give us an overview of the European situation.
So Europe is like everywhere else. It's buoyant. It's happening everywhere. But I think what's interesting is that some of the Nordic countries are coming up now, and there's a huge amount of development going on up there. There's a huge amount of development going on in Eastern Europe, which wasn't there before. The connectivity is there now. The power has always been there. So I think that you know, it is an incredibly buoyant market at the moment, and everywhere, just literally everywhere. I mean, FlapD we kind of all know about. It's kind of been there for a while now. But there's other places that are up and coming. You know, Marseille, Lyon, just other cities now that are really beginning to come up and behind. And I think it's great, because it just shows, you know, that the growth in the industry is huge.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of movements in the Nordics, especially in the Nordics. I mean, all the acquisitions that we've seen, Green Mountain, Digiplex, the birth of new companies in Finland willing to spend $1 billion. We've seen all the development across the entire of Southern Europe, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece,
Exactly.
south of France. So it's incredible what's happening in this market. Anthony?
Yeah, not much to add to what the other speakers have said, really. Just that we are seeing kind of phenomenal growth, whether that's in existing capacity and existing data centers, or new data center builds from new players, as well as existing players expanding into new territories. It's kind of growth everywhere, really, and it's because of those bandwidth demands. I mean, every day I'm seeing reports from some of the service providers across Europe that they're hitting their maximum data transferred on their own internal networks and external networks. They keep breaking records every week. It's the data usage is phenomenal, and with the working from home, it's getting bigger and bigger.
Do we have any fears that usage might drop once people start getting back to work? I guess not in the next 2 months, unfortunately. Over the next maybe 6 to 8 months, did you guys see any change?
They're not going back to work. They're not going back. There was a survey out yesterday that said 4 out of 5 people who worked from home during the pandemic do not want to ever go back to the office. So it just won't change. It's just going to keep rising, I believe.
The profile, Joe, will change. You know, what happened ultimately during the first phases of the pandemic was the amount of data that was being manipulated and used was similar. It just wasn't being manipulated through a big pipe into a business. It was being distributed into smaller pipes into people's homes. But effectively, what you found was the value of a centralized data system or a hybrid data system came to the fore. And what we're finding now, and to the other speaker's point, is that a lot of people during that period that maybe had still a lot of on-premise stuff realized they couldn't get essential workers to their office, so they couldn't get into their office, so they couldn't get access to the office. So I think what it's facilitated is, you know, hybrid, it's coming away from your on-premise to a co-location managed services. So where the data is manipulated from and where the data centers are, because this is a key thing why clusters will remain strong like FlapD, is because for every packet of data that goes to a device, there could be up to 10 packets of data between data centers. So that's why the interoperability is so important for the clusters. So I think the data itself as a dataverse, or what they call it now, the new metaverses, yeah, they're growing and growing. But what's happening is that you have a more B2B, you've got more machine to machine, data center to data center, data center to end user, data center to businesses. But effectively, it's constantly growing, but it's just coming from different places. And I guess some of the other speakers will talk about the edge and stuff like that. But homes are just a new or a variant of the edge, aren't they? That's all they are. What is the edge? It's just wherever you access your data, and whether it's the device or your eyeballs. So let's look at the end users' homes like a small node on the edge, right?
The edge of the edge.
The edge of the edge. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Anthony, David, sorry.
Yeah, I think we could have a whole other panel discussion on how you define edge.
Yeah, 4 5 years down the line, we still haven't come up with a definition.
So to kind of echo what the other people have said, what we've seen in our customer base is a lot of people who either couldn't access their offices during the lockdowns, or have decided to downsize or move out of city centre locations, are giving up their offices, and they're taking the IT they had on-prem, putting it into a data centre, and everyone's just connecting remotely into that. So even if their workers go back into the office, they're still going to connect remotely from their office to the data centre location. And we've seen, I would say that's probably been the driver of 2/3 of the deals we've done in the last 18 months is people on-prem. And I think that says quite a lot to, I remember 5 years ago, 6 years ago, everyone saying all the on-prem stuff is gone. It's already out of people's offices. There's no more on-prem to move. And I think what this has shown in the last 18 months is there's still a lot of IT on-prem in people's offices.
David, they often say there's no more COBOL in the world, and yet there's an awful lot of COBOL.
And the cloud's going to kill the data center market.
You know?
Well, it's called the clickbait headlines to attract the eyes in. But I mean, David, now you're bringing the idea of actually people going to data centers more outside of the city centers. That's actually a trend that we've seen growing in the last few years, and I guess in the last 24 months, and especially this year, we've really seen the main metros, the expansion outside the main metros take place, not just in the UK, but across Europe. I mean, in Ireland is the same thing. We've seen it a bit in the Nordics. We're starting to see it now in France as well, more heavily. How do you guys see the trends of operators moving outside of the big cities? Is this, I guess, it will be sustained, I guess, from what you just said. But how do we see this spanning out over the next, say, 5 to 10 years?
I think it will continue, because the only places that have got space to build new data centers are outside of city centers. You've got some constraints on fiber and network connectivity in areas, but that's overcomable with enough capital. Certainly for people like Microsoft and Facebook, they can solve those problems. I mean, one of the reasons our data centers have been outside, we never opened one in central London. And that's mostly because the engineers of our customers don't live in the center of cities. And having been a customer of Telecity and Equinix and everything in the past, or Redbus and RX Europe as it was, going from where you live into a city centre to go to a data centre is a pain. No one really wants to do it. So if you can bring the data centres out of the city centre, you make access easier, they're cheaper to build, they're cheaper to run, and you're generally, both going back to the edge term, you're closer to where your users are.
Okay. Anthony?
Yeah, I was just going to say something very similar. Is, as we just discussed, the kind of the profile of where the workplace is changing. The workplace isn't in the city centres anymore. And coupled with that, the mass rollout of fibre infrastructure across the whole of the region has meant that there aren't the not spots anymore that there were. Is, yeah, if you're Facebook or Google, you build your data centre wherever the power's cheap because you'll get fibre to it. But nowadays, you can get fibre anywhere, and it's becoming more ubiquitous, which makes it easier, and location becomes less about being close to everybody else because everybody else is spread out.
That's actually a very good point, because we've seen also a lot of investments in 2021 around just rural inclusion, building fiber networks across rural areas of several different countries, especially in France. Even today, I was just reading a €3 billion roadmap to build France's rural fiber networks. Alex, I think you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that the flat D kind of model, I think, will change. I know that Gary won't like me saying this, but I think it will change in the sense that there will be additions to flat D. Flat D will always be there; it will always be a requirement. But there will be additional places, additional new hubs that come along. And I think that's probably a good thing, because flat D has had its issues over the last few years. But you're going to see more hubs coming in from different areas. That I think demand goes back to what David said. Really, the demand is not in those major cities anymore. It is certainly true that interoperability is still important, but equally, the demand will be driven by different factors. So, it may be driven by sustainability, it may be driven by cost, it may be driven by location of engineers, but certainly there are going to be new hubs, I believe.
Okay,
100%, and let's hope for a global society perspective that happens as well, because what's often forgotten about these forums, and certainly when I go to events, there's not enough discussion around data. Way too much discussion around centers. We don't need centers unless we understand data, and not all data is the same. Not all cats running up curtains needs to be in a high latency sensitive, very high energy location. It can be anywhere. It can be up as high in the north as you can have it. So what we have to, and what we're going to start to see now becoming more and more prevalent is, we're entering an era where we're going to have 160 to 170 zettabytes of data. That's not going to sit in 10 metros. There'll be portions of that which will be analytics requirements. So that can be anywhere it needs to be. You're going to have time sensitive stuff, and that's going to need to be closer to other data sensitive data. And then you're going to have other stuff that's going to genuinely need to be close to the device that it needs to be close to. So when we look at data and we look at the trends in data, that'll dictate to a great degree where the centers go. So it's no surprise that you're seeing multiple $1 billion euro rollouts everywhere, because ultimately where you have 40 million people, that's classified as a proximity zone for data. So what is that proximity zone for data? It's the end users want access to Airbnb, Spotify, Netflix. So these providers are on top of the hyperscales and to a great degree are AWS. So everywhere you see a 40 million catchment, whether that's Milan, whether that's Marseille, whether that's Nairobi, you're going to see a proximity zone. So I think what will happen, and what I'd like to hope will happen, is more and more of the center people start to learn more about data. And then we can actually sell the value of the data center industry to policymakers and people. Because when I listen to data center people talking about their value, it's always about energy. It's always about water. It's all about the how, and they don't talk about the why. So exactly what Alex is saying, there are physical constraints in metros, whether they're North Virginia, whether they're Singapore, Frankfurt, London, there's two total different sciences at play here. There's photonic science and there's electron science. And one, since Faraday, goes very slowly. It's a big, arduous, capital-intensive industry. The data industry is just always been so nimble. So I think the more people, if you want to understand where the centers are going to reside, learn about the different subsets of data. And there's so much data, it'll all be that type of data there, that type of data there, that type of data there. And that's, to me, what I think will have to happen for us to have more informed and better discussions with journalists, with policymakers, with all of these people. Because right now they just see big sheds sucking in electrons. Why?
Yeah.
And
Could I just comment there, Joe, on something that Gary said, because I think it's really interesting. This, I mean, first of all, I agree with Gary what you're saying. That there is too much discussion about the centre and not enough about the data. I totally agree with you. I think one thing we've missed is smart cities, which I think are going to drive data centre construction in a new way. But I also think that Gary makes a really, really good point here about the whole industry and the way it talks. And Joe, I've said this before, but people are always talking about, I've got a 100 megawatt data center, I've got a 150 megawatt data center, I've got this, I've got that. It's ridiculous. This mine's bigger than yours. What they should be saying is, look, here are the benefits of my data center. This is what happens. This is how you get your Netflix. This is how you get to do the things that you do. This is how we get a vaccine for this pandemic. These are the benefits. Forget the power. Nobody's interested in the amount of power you've got. What they're interested in is the benefits you bring to society and to the economy. And I think that's just something that, as an industry, we've been absolutely terrible at for years and years and years. We've just been going, I've got 100 megawatts of power. And it's ridiculous. It's just silly.
But let me bring in Tash now, because you've also written a piece recently on this, which was a really good thought leadership piece. So Tash, share with us your thoughts.
It's really, we've been looking at the tier 2 data center market. I mean, a few of the other panelists have already spoken about how the FLAP-D region isn't not the only region, and I think we've mentioned a few of the other areas which are being looked at: the Nordics, Milan, Eastern Europe as well. And I think it's just really adding on to what has been said. Obviously, the increased demand. And just that, I mean, you think about all of the areas where there's a high population, where there's a lot of, I guess, younger people as well. There's demand for IT and services, all of that concentration. And it's throughout Europe, of course. So you can't just have, the data centers in certain parts in those parts where they traditionally have been. Like they need to be everywhere because they are needed.
No, absolutely. Before I carry on, let me just ask if any attendees wants to ask any questions. Do put them in the box now, and then we'll go through them in a few minutes, in about 10 minutes or so. I know we've already kind of mentioned energy, and we can talk about benefits as well on top of energy, but there's a lot of conversation around energy in Europe. So I just wanted to ask you guys if you think a lot of this conversation is panic, or do we have a real issue on our hands in terms of providing power to facilities? Because we've seen a lot of things. We've seen things in Dublin, in Ireland. We've seen in the Netherlands. We've seen in the UK as well in some places. There's a few other markets out there that are having this conversation, this problem. New markets, up and coming markets, they are having this discussion now, especially around hydrogen and everything. What do you guys think? Because we've also got a natural energy crisis on our hands in terms of just even heating houses and all this sort of thing. So give us your view. Who would like to go first? Gary, David?
You see, you're starting from a great place there. That there's Europe has an energy security of supply issue due to non-data center related stuff. However, if one was to believe the press, national and international, you'd think that data centers were responsible for everything to do with energy crisis, blackouts, and all these other very highly emotive words. The reality is the world And if you looked at COP26 and you took the takeaways, there are two mega trends going on right now. There's a decarbonization of all of our societies on every level. And that decarbonization, particularly for transport and for home heating, is going to depend on electrical grids. So those electrical grids in their own right are going through a massive autonomous decarbonization process, which is challenging when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine and we can't make green hydrogen efficient cost. So that in its own right is a challenge, irrespective of anything. Then we throw on the second megatrend, which is back to what we said earlier of the fourth industrial revolution, which is the digitalization of the planet, or the dematerialization of the planet created by digital. Yeah. And you then throw that on top of this natural decarbonization, and something has to give. One is at 1,000 miles an hour. As our co-panelists were talking earlier, we can change the speed between data centers by time of 10 by 2 cards going into 2 routers. That's it. That's all we have to do on a different end of fiber. You try that with electricity. So when those two universes collide, guess what? You don't just have scientific collisions, you've mindset collisions as well. Because no disrespect to anybody that's on this call that comes from a grid development or an engineering background for electricity, but it's a different mindset to the data mindset. If we're not changing every 10 months, we're going through slow. Traditionally, grids haven't changed that much in 100 years. So that's a whole philosophy colliding. But it's easy, isn't it? When you have change, you have different reactions. Some people embrace it, some people beat it up, and some people run away. And there's no running away from the digitalization thing. And it's causing conflict. And the overall desire now should be like what we have now in Dublin, for instance. We're lucky to this regard. We've built the National Climate Action Plan, top level. Feeding into that is the national grid development to be decarbonized by 80%. And feeding into that is how we're going to facilitate another 2 gigawatts of data centers. So that gives us some wiggle room as distinct to trying to, which is happening in so many other places, transpose an industry on top of an already industry that's trying to get its head around security of supply, cost. And then, of course, and I'll leave it to the other speakers, we've had such a unique situation the last 7 months. It's called the Great Calm. It's been called the lowest wind in Europe in 70 years. So what that's done is that's taught us, hey, we better get working on another option as well as wind, as well as solar. And that's why you've got so many discussions now around nuclear again, right?
I mean, we had the perfect known storm over the last few months.
That's what they call it, the great calm. You have to have a label for everything these days, don't we?
Of course you have to. I mean, what's a storm without a name as well? And like anything without a name or an acronym.
They've got a lot worse since we've named them. That's what I've noticed.
We lost that. Alex, let me bring you into this as well, because you're very involved with the energy conversations. There's also the European Data Center Pack, Energy Pack. Sorry, I forgot the exact name of the pack, but you can correct me.
Okay, so yeah, I just make a very quick point on what Gary was saying there. I mean, I think that as an industry, and I go back to what I said earlier about changing language, as an industry, we have brought this on ourselves when we've talked constantly about power, about the amount of power we've got on reservation and the amount of power we want, etc. This is what's given governments the impression that we are pariahs and that we're actually, responsible for all the blackouts and the shortages and everything else, which is not actually true. But just to mention, the climate neutral data center pact, it's called. So that's a pact that was initiated by the European Data Center Association in conjunction with CITSI. And what it's about is basically we have an agreement and we are creating a pathway. I can't say it's fully created. We are creating a pathway now to actually become climate neutral by 2030. Now, the pact is obviously a fantastic thing with signatories to it, range from everybody from the big hyperscalers down to smaller operators, down to really small operators. But the signatories are enormous. I can't remember the actual number anymore. But the point about it is that as an industry, we have got to look inward as well. I mean, we are great for the environment, if that's the truth. Whilst we've talked about power for years and given governments the impression that we're not good for the environment, we are. If you want the latest Ed Sheeran CD, what's better for the environment? Download it from the internet, or go and extract minerals from the ground and transport them and make them into plastics, print them, sort of package them, distribute them, and get them to a shop, and I get in my car and go and buy it. It's clearly better to download it. So that analogy can be applied to the automotive industry, to food, to whatever you want to apply it to. So data centers are very good for the environment, but we have given the impression through our own language that we are in fact bad for the environment, because all we've talked about for 20 years, over 20 years, as I'm obviously ancient, so I remember when this all started, when I used to work many years ago in what was called intelligent buildings, before anybody had even thought of data centers. But when this all started, the first thing that everybody did was, I've got this much power and I've got this much. And that's really what's brought it on ourselves. So we've got to change now the way we talk. And when we talk to Europe, when we're through the Climate Neutral Data Center Pact, we're talking to Europe all the time, and we're talking to the commissioners, and we're talking to the policymakers. And when we're talking to them, we've had to change the way we talk and start talking about the benefits that we bring, the data, if you like, what Gary said. We've got to start talking about the benefits and stop talking about power, because the first thing they do is they come to the table and they say, well, you're responsible for all this power use. So we've got to change.
No, I absolutely make a very good point, and it's a circular economy. I mean, you just take away all the packaging and everything. I think the main takeaway is that you like Ed Sheeran. You're a fan of Ed Sheeran.
It could have been anybody. Well, it could have been ABBA.
No. David.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to make the same point about efficiency of systems. It's something that's almost always missed, is how much more efficient a system can be when it's moved from an office into a data center, or how much less carbon is used by people doing things like this rather than traveling up to a center or flying abroad to attend an event. And that is all enabled by data centers. But we do have an industry problem that every single conference I go to, it's going, so-and-so is building 100 megawatts, so-and-so is building 150 megawatts. And it was even on this panel, when we were talking about it earlier, it was 100 megawatts here, 100 megawatts there, which annoys me as well, because no one ever talks about the small data centers. And we run sort of 3-4 megawatt facilities, which always get left out of every kind of market analysis. So there is a whole section of the market that no one ever talks about. But I mean, data centers themselves, we have economic incentives to be efficient and to reduce our power consumption. So power is the biggest cost. And that's like one of the reasons why we've gone to highly efficient cooling systems in our data centers. We weren't forced to do it, but we've put in adiabatic systems and cooling towers and got one of our sites running at about 1.17 PUE, and the other one's running about 1.3, 1.29. So we already have an economic incentive to reduce our consumption. But it does sometimes feel a little bit like data centers and consumption reduction is being scapegoated for a underinvestment in grid infrastructure and power generation. And that's certainly the feeling I've kind of got at the moment, is Absolutely. They don't want to put the long-term project planning into building a new grid or a smart grid or a whole load of new nuclear power stations or wind farms. So they're going, actually, just reduce your consumption. In terms of energy crisis, yeah, to an extent, I think it's more of a natural gas crisis rather than an electricity crisis, particularly acute in the UK because we're so reliant on natural gas because we haven't had any wind. And we've switched all of our power over to wind. But I think that will ease going into next year.
I think what you're saying about using data centers as an excuse as well, it's a very, very good point, an important point. And we're seeing that taken to an extreme now in Russia, for example. where they are really looking into new taxes and everything, and almost just shutting hosting businesses down and blaming blackouts on data centers. Anthony.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a bit about technology and technological advancement. Obviously, with newer data centers, it's newer equipment, which is less power hungry, but also as we increase the speeds, the kind of watts per gigabit is decreasing every time we introduce a new technology. And just to kind of give some numbers around it, if you look at kind of traditional 10 gig ports, 10 gig ports are in the kind of 1 watt per gig, 1 watt for 10 gigs kind of range. And when you go to 100 gigs, you're not timesing that by 10, you're timesing it by 2 or 3. And then when you go to 400 gig, you're timesing it by 2 or 3 again, not timesing it by 4 from 100. So you can kind of have 400 gigs in sub 10 watts versus your 10 gig at 1 watt. And obviously, as we're using more data, we're using more power overall, but it's kind of, some devices are still only going to need small amounts of data. It's a lot of small amounts of data that we're serving. So we are reducing that power consumption per gigabit, and that's going to be critical. And that's only going to get better as we advance to higher speeds and we move away from electrical switching, moving to optical switching. There's big power savings to be made there. So there's things we can do to reduce that footprint by reducing our power consumption with technology.
And I guess we can even now go into artificial intelligence and bring that in as well, and that would be a whole nother topic. But Tash, let me bring you in as well for you to share your thoughts with this.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that the panelists have said. I do think they were taking into account that data centers have been made out to be what they are with power consumption. But ultimately, there is an aspect of that which is true. And I think it's great that companies have signed up to the pledge and everything. And obviously, as David said, there's already tracking that needs to be done for economic incentive. But I also feel like PUE is good, but it's just the tip of the iceberg, really. And there's more that could be done. The kind of technology software part of it also. I mean, there are other aspects. We've looked at other ways of cooling natural resources, but looking at the software, looking at the whole supply chain, kind of, I think the next step is, it's great that companies have signed up to the pledge, but how will we make sure that this happens? What are the next steps? How do we make sure that whichever company doesn't just say, okay, we've signed up to, being carbon neutral. How do we do this? I think the conversations really need to move into that.
Really get into the fifth gear and also start taking action. Because there's things out there that we don't actually need to discuss anymore. There's small things that we can start doing across every building, just bring the carbon footprint down. Alex.
Yeah, I was just going to say there are measures in place through the Carbon Neutral Data Center Pact. There are actual measures people have to report. That report is anonymized data, but it's absolutely, you can't just say, well, I've signed up to the pact and that's it. Tick, move on. You've got to actually demonstrate that you really are doing what you're saying you're doing. So I think that's a really good point. I just want to say, David, I spent most of my life talking about small data centers, so there is someone talking about it.
Yeah.
I've written a little bit about boutique ones as well, but I promise I'll do better.
But Joe, when you think about it, it's a very young industry. Never has an industry been perpetrated on the earth that has taken over everybody's life so quickly. In 15 years, there wasn't a smartphone. Let's call it that. That's been the absolute the increase in year on year. So words matter. Protocols matter. All that other stuff matters. But there is generally an acceptance that data is going nowhere. But what we call it is so important. So all of the panelists, as individually, I've just been noting it down, said smart at least once. Yeah. Now, smart is only smart. Smart grid, smart thermostat, smart car, smart city, smart anything is only smart because of data. Now, if I ask all policymakers to say, do you know that the decarbonisation of Paris with the Smart City Initiative by 40% is due to data because that's what makes it smart? They'd say, Really? That's the difference. We need to stop using generic words and actually start making them tangible. So smart should be replaced with data. So it should be called data cars or data thermostats, whatever, because that's just been misconnected. The other is we also use, because we possibly within the industry don't know enough about it, also mention way too much about social media. So what the perception is that social media is what's driving all these big data centers. Not the fact that Facebook also runs, 2.5 million SME businesses. It's a social media. It's cats running up curtains. So that basically gives people a particular perspective. The other point, which is probably one that we should get behind, is a set of numbers, a global set of numbers that people are comfortable talking about, robust, and we can talk about. Because just today I saw from some of the competing geographies within Europe alone, 18% are saying if the world's electricity will be used by data centers, that's why you should move to us. So that's just what the media will pick up on. That's what policymakers will pick up on. The biggest one. So while Alex and the boys are getting beaten up they will find that particular term of reference. Whereas we need a set, and what we've been using, and I think that I think it's robust enough to say, because it's in its 4th year, is the International Energy Association's numbers. Yeah. And it's extraordinary because it encapsulates all that the other speakers have said. In the past 10 years, we've seen a 12.5 time increase in transmission of data and a 7.5 times compute for a 3% increase in electrical use. Why? Because like what David was saying, there have been thousands of small wiring closets with servers and data centers on premise being consolidated into much more efficient. But we need a set of numbers that can capture all that. And, otherwise we have to believe that the industry is misunderstood, therefore easy targets and under attack. So the best thing to do when you're under attack is to get everybody behind a set of plan and the numbers. So when I hear 18% from some of the geographies, that's the reason why you should move to us. That's not a good day in the office, because that's what the policymakers, the journalists, not you, of course, because you're a well-researched founded journalist.
You don't have to. I didn't pay him, by the way.
No, check is in the post. But for those that are detracting, they just look for that type of stuff, and that's why the industry lets itself down. But you can't blame geographies, because a lot of the geographies are actually inward investment groups. They're not technology companies.
Okay. Gary, you're probably not going to like me anymore. I'm going to lose some points with you now, but we are running out of time. We've literally got about 1 minute. We'll skip all the conversation about politics, European politics. But I just want to ask one question. If there's one thing that you guys want to see done by the end of 2022, if we sit back here in 1 year's time and you expect something to have been done, what would it be? Very short answers now. So who would like to jump in? Alex, you're unmuted, so let's go with you first.
I was going to make a comment on the other thing, but change the language. Change the language. That's the thing that will help us all. And just a very, very, very quick point, just to let you know that the European Data Center Association normally responds to about 3 to 5 consultations from the EU per year. In the last 12 months, we've responded to 50. So that shows how much people are looking at us.
Amazing. Anthony?
I think there's going to be continued growth, and it's just don't stop it happening. That's all we need.
Okay, Tash.
Echoing that, and just the education piece. There's lots of, because it's such a growing industry, I think there's a lot of people looking at it, but there's also companies getting involved that don't have the experience. So just helping with the education.
Okay, and David.
I probably would say education of policymakers, as well as the wider industry. Tech UK and Emma Fryer struggles with this on almost a daily basis, I think. It's so new that they don't understand it, I think.
Well, Amy's doing an amazing work. And Gary, 2 words.
I can't do it in 2 words, but I would very much like 80% of the market is being driven by 4 companies in Europe, possibly North America as well. They need to come out to play. They need to be more visible. They can't be hiding behind others. It's just not any more acceptable. We need to see them out fronting up, and not just hiding behind policy-based people, the engineers, the sustainable people, because those 4 companies are the origin of 80+%, possibly more. And that's a real challenge and a disappointment, in my opinion.
Okay. I agree with everything that everyone said, and I'll probably add in as well to see a bit more diversity in 12 months' time. Gender diversity and all other types of diversity will be also very good across the sector, across Europe and the world. But thank you so much, guys, for your time, for joining us today. And on behalf of the speakers, I would like to thank everyone for tuning in and participating in today's roundtable. Just a quick reminder, our speakers are staying on for the remainder of the lunch hour to answer any of your questions. So meet them back in the networking lounge at the table. And to our viewers, if you're one of the 100 registrants, we hope you enjoyed your lunch. Make sure you visit us at jsa.net to register for more coming JSA virtual roundtables, including our next one, where leaders in our industry will talk about lessons learned and predictions for the new year for telecoms and data centers. With that, we wrap up today's roundtable. Look out for the playback of this session coming soon on JSA TV and JSA podcast. From me and the team at JSA, we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and we'll see you back in January. And in the meantime, see you back in the networking lounge, and happy networking.